and welcome to Let's Get the Skinny. Today on the show, I have Dr. Jillian Murphy. Jillian, thank you so much for joining.
Hi, I'm very excited to be here. I haven't seen Kiki in a long time, so I'm happy to be here and get to see your beautiful face.
Aw, thank you. Yeah, the first time we met in real life, it was in Mexico City through a mutual friend. But for those of you who don't know Jillian, she's essentially the OG as it relates to intuitive eating. She was talking about intuitive eating, food freedom, body love, way before it was cool and way before literally everyone started talking about it many, many years ago. And Dr. Jillian is a licensed doctor of naturopathic medicine. Her background includes 10 years of general naturopathic practice, along with 15 years of working in various fields, including disordered eating, intuitive eating, body image, with additional training in CBT and coaching. And so I'm really excited to talk to you today about detoxing and practical, real as fuck ways that we can feel better in our body inside out, from a naturopathic doctor who I know truly, truly gets it. I read your emails. Dr. Jillian has literally the best newsletter ever. It's hilarious and very, very helpful. So I'd like to start by asking you, when did you start redirecting your focus from more like food freedom to being a little bit more strategic in helping women write their own health story, which might actually include some healthy-ish add-ons or detoxing? And why did you decide to go down that route in the end?
Right. Well, like you said, I've been part of the intuitive eating, anti-diet, body positive space since like 2012 or 13, which I'm not the originator of any of this, but like you said, there were very, very few people talking about this. When I first started sending out newsletters, people were like, "Oh my God, I've never heard of this before." But when you spend enough time in that space and you work with enough people, you start to see the thousands of variations of normal and the way that people move through things. And then I think also just as an evolution of my own life, I'm 44 now. So I started this in my mid 30s. And as I moved through like the late 30s into my early 40s, there's definitely you know, bits of perimenopause that start to pop up. More and more women experience actual health concerns because with perimenopausal hormonal changes can come, cholesterol issues or blood pressure issues or blood sugar issues. And so for me, I don't really feel like I am deviating from the intuitive eating message. I feel like I'm rounding it out. So I always try to be clear about that I don't feel like I'm doing anything necessarily new. Gentle nutrition has always been a part of intuitive eating, but for very obvious reasons, which I could lay out. When people are first getting introduced to intuitive eating, there's not a lot of direction around gentle nutrition in that book. Because where people's brains are at is they would want to go straight to the gentle nutrition chapter and they want to hyper focus on it. Give me the steps. I'll skip the mess. I'll skip the work of healing up my relationship with food and my body. And I'm just going to keep, pounding on nutrition. So for those reasons, the women who wrote that book really didn't go that far into gentle nutrition. They touch on it, but they don't go that far into it. But it is clear in their work that if your body doesn't feel good, that is your body telling you something. That is your intuition or your body knowing, speaking to you. And so I feel like what I naturally started to do as a naturopath is, with the women that I was working with, and some men, I never want to exclude them, there's just fewer of them, is I started diving deeper into that sort of end of the pond. I was ready for that quite early in the work. That's always been part of my journey is yes, I want to be intuitive. But there's a few things. My life is busy. My life is very busy and very demanding. The world is busy and noisy and demanding. And so I needed to find a way to connect to my body through that noise because it's hard to always just hear, quote unquote, hear our intuition. There are things in our environment and in the food that we eat that can cloud up what we hear from our intuition. There are health challenges that can make it difficult to just, quote unquote, be intuitive. And so what I started naturally doing was creating this framework for reclaiming some boundaries and the no around taking care of ourselves. So to me, intuitive eating, just to back up a little bit, when people tend to look for intuitive eating is when they've been stuck in inappropriate no's for a really long time, like a really long time, saying no to everything, trying to cut things out, demonizing things. Intuitive eating is this attempt at reclaiming the yes, right? Like, how do I say yes to myself again? Yes to enjoyment, yes to nourishing myself, to being full, all of those things. And so for me, this work is about that integration of yes and no, and like finding the no again with like better perspective and a more loving, compassionate approach. Yeah.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned about the perimenopause and how it's sometimes these not necessarily external factors because it's still an internal thing that's happening, but I can totally relate in that when I got into intuitive eating, I was in my early to mid 20s, and at that time in my life, like, yeah, I could do gentle nutrition or I could not. And either way, I was kind of going to feel okay.
Yeah.
But then as you get into even in your 30s, I noticed my body changing a little bit. And I'm not saying like, oh my God, I have to biohack it to the end of time. But at the same time, you do sort of notice it's like, okay, yeah, I can have the croissant, for breakfast and I'm going to survive and everything is going to be fine. But also, maybe if I have it in a slightly different way, or if I skip it and have it, at the end of lunch or something like that, then I will feel better. And for those who haven't heard that term, gentle nutrition, what does it mean to you and how does it look from a practical sense?
Well, I don't really use that. I mean, that's in the intuitive eating book, which I think is this combination of uh combine finding our best way to eat, which is like an overlap of what helps us feel physically our best, but what also helps us or allows us to live a life that feels really good to us. So it's that trade-off of like, okay, I suppose on some level I could theoretically imagine that never eating refined sugar might make me feel slightly more energetic, but the trade-off, like what I would have to give up in terms of how I, like Jill Murphy, likes to live her life, the trade-off isn't worth it for me, so that overlap of gentle nutrition is like, how can I, what is the amount of sugar that I want to allow in that makes life really fun, and there's variety and socialization and birthday parties and holidays, but how can I balance that with what feels good in my body? And so again, that framework is presented in intuitive eating, but there is a lot of work that goes into figuring that out, so the framework that I created, I call it healthy-ish eating, and it really walks people through experimenting with figuring out that balance. And that's exactly it. Like the example you gave, I often give an example of like when I hit my late 30s to early 40s, like sugar does work differently in my body at the moment. And like, I don't demonize it. I have no beef with sugar. I'm cool with it. I'll eat it anytime. I eat it regularly, but like eating a lot of refined sugar in the middle of my day makes me tired, and I don't want to feel sleepy in my one-on-one sessions. So I make choices around when and how I consume those foods so that I get to live a life that I love, but I feel good for the most part while I'm doing it. But like I said, there's a whole lot of feelings that can come up for people. First, in just allowing sugar back into their diet sometimes, but then also coming full circle to start making decisions about how much sugar is allowed. I mean, I'm just using sugar as an example. It could be fat, it could be croissants, it could be fried food, it could be takeout, it could be any number of things. Yeah.
Yeah. And for those who are listening, and I think most women, as you kind of touched on earlier, where it's like we want to dive deep straight into the like, okay, wait, so tell me what to do and like, how to optimize. Well, what would you say is a way to kind of check ourselves before we wreck ourselves in terms of, okay, at first you need to get the baseline of intuitive eating kind of over with. And that's how I work with my clients in the sense of, no, like we're not going to do all these hacks and like the strategic kind of add-ins or takeaways until you become at least fairly neutral around food. Is there kind of a metric or a barometer, or like how do you know when it's safe to kind of start talking about or start thinking about nutrition? Or does it automatically, should you kind of factor that in right away? I'm just wondering your perspective on like, okay,
Yeah.
should sometimes this conversation that we're about to have, should it actually be with a disclaimer of like, except don't listen if you're not necessarily in this kind of place. And if you're in the depths of somewhere else, so like ignore us.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that comes up every time I talk about this work, and it's a super valid conversation because I'm talking about, I am talking about diving deep into one end of the framework, and clearly there's all this other work. It's tricky because the real truth of the matter is that for the most part, I've just done this long enough that when I'm talking to someone, I can tell
Yeah.
based on how they talk about food, what their goals are, how challenging it is for them to be flexible with food. I can start to tell. If I was going to give more concrete uh, parameters around it, I do eating assessments with people, so I get a bit of a vibe on like how competent are they of eating. So how positive do they feel about food? How in touch with internal regulation are they? Are they flexible? Do they feed themselves regularly? Like I get a feel around that. And then the other thing I would say is I really like that word that you use, neutrality. So you know, are you able to tell when you are hungry? Are you able to feed yourself relatively easily when you're hungry? Do you allow yourself to be satiated, which is like not just getting enough food, but eating food that actually like allows you to feel done and good and like, like you've eaten for some pleasure. Are you able to do those things relatively easily? And are you not thinking about food and body all day? Like those are the things that I would want to know. And if you're not, like, if you can do those things, if you can be relatively flexible, if you're not thinking about food in your body all day, if there is an aspect of neutrality, then I think you can just dive right into this work, right? But if you are still on a bit of a roller coaster, if the relationship with food still feels dramatic, up, down, restricting, overdoing it, then I think there's like work to do first.
Totally. I love that. And I so agree. And so diving straight in, what do you think are most women missing out on as it relates to optimizing our health? And by that, I mean, it sounds so vague, but like being in a body where we feel comfortable in, where we feel energized, where we have, clear skin, good sleep, good digestion. What do you think is either the main piece or some of the main pieces that most people are lacking? Because
Yeah.
there's always something that's being demonized as popular, and I feel like right now everyone's really focusing on sleep will cure all, and like stay away from lectins, or like whatever it is, except in a couple of years it'll be something different. What do you think is the thing that um, people are not necessarily paying enough attention to, because you can get kind of good returns on it if you give it a little bit more attention and love?
Okay, so this is going to be, I don't know if this is a bullshit answer or not, but it's the truth. I think it's discernment. And for me, discernment is a really deep knowing and acceptance of who we are as people and eaters and self-carers, so that we have the ability to take in information and filter it through put it through that filter of like, who am I? And what is it that I really enjoy and like, and like what gets me closer to how I want to feel in this body and life, and what takes me further away. And the younger you are, the more question marks there's going to be around that, because it takes time to figure these things out. But I feel like diet culture has trained so many of us into all or nothing thinking, into patriarchy. Capitalism has trained us into believing that people outside of ourselves know better for us than we do. And so we're always kind of like looking for that outside affirmation of like what we should be doing. Oh, it's lectins. Oh, it's this. It's never going to be one thing. It's always going to be this sort of like magical formula based on who you are and the challenges in your life and the privileges in your life, and like what that magical formula looks like is going to be a little different. So for me, again, where I really put my time with Healthy-ish is figuring out the yeses and the nos and how to manage them, because it's so interesting, like teaching women how to say no, again, even teaching myself how to say no, how like saying no to an ice cream cone when I know that ice cream cone is going to give me a stomach ache, can pull up feelings of like, oh, I'm such a victim. Like, oh, I'm restricted. Oh, and then I have to like work my way through. I have like a whole process of working women through like, are you actually restricted? Are you hungry? Do
Yeah.
you need food? Are you a
Yeah.
victim or are you an adult making a choice? Like we work through these things, but having the ability to emotionally regulate through yeses and nos to
Mm.
to be safe around food and be able to regulate ourselves, it just allows for this, discernment. And then, oh, sorry. And then the other thing that's part of discernment is flexibility. So
Yeah.
many people can, you know, it falls into that all or nothing category, but they can like say yes or, say no to the lectins and totally cut the lectins out. But the minute the lectins come back in a little bit, everything's fallen apart and like, it's all for
Yeah.
naught. Flexibility is so key. And again, very few of us have been taught how to set gentle parameters and boundaries and be flexible within them. Most people have been taught how to say no to everything or how to say yes to everything and nowhere in between. So discernment, which
Mm.
involves like knowing who we are, accepting who we are as eaters. Like I enjoy sugar. That is a part of who I am. I am never going to be someone who doesn't enjoy sugar.
Yeah,
Because
I'm
how do I am?
right there with you, girl.
Yeah.
And I love what you're bringing up where it's like you need to kind of check yourself, because I do the same thing. Sometimes I will catch myself pitying myself a little bit, like, oh, or like, oh my goodness, you're so good, right? And it's like, no, don't give yourself that bullshit. In that, like, you just don't want to feel shit, and that's why, yeah. Sometimes when
Yeah.
my boyfriend is like, eating like candy at 10 o'clock at night, like there's a piece of me that like, that could feel good, right? But then I'm like, no, like that is going to disrupt my sleep. Like I don't even really like that candy, like whatever. And you have to I have to look at that and make sure that I'm not getting into that story of like, wow, like you were good, because that will only be a backlash in the end, versus kind of like recognizing, no, I'm making a choice here and I'm fully happy with that choice. And there's no self-pity that needs to
Yeah,
happen here.
absolutely.
Um,
But it sometimes requires some like, just in the same way that I had to coach women, and I'm sure you do too, into saying yes to food
yeah,
and managing all
yeah,
the thoughts and feelings that come around saying, reintroducing grains or sugar or whatever it is.
yeah.
Learning how to say no sometimes requires some like emotional regulation work as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, just to go off possibly on a slight tangent, a question that I get quite a bit from clients is sometimes they'll ask me like, oh, but like I'm, especially those that are working on food freedom, right?
Yeah.
And they'll have this idea of like, oh, actually, like I do want a banana bread. And there's almost like this urgency to like, so I need to have it now to prove myself that I can have it, right? And I personally am sort of like, okay, there's no rush. Like you don't have to have it in the next hour in order to kind of like prove to yourself that you officially now allow yourself banana bread, right? But I'm curious as to how you sort of navigate that with clients. And I assume it's individualized, but I'm not sure if you came across that with your work as well, where sometimes when we're exploring food freedom, there's almost like, it's like, who are you trying to convince here? Is it me? Is it
Yeah.
you? But it
Yeah.
can be
And
that.
sometimes early in the work that does happen. And I always err when I first start working with women. I always err on the side of yes, because I feel like we've just been so deeply trained into the no and controlling ourselves and keeping it together. So I really do kind of err on the side of like, fucking eat it then. If you really want it, eat it, but like be objective about it. Be clear on, did you enjoy it? How did it feel in your body? Okay, moving on. When we get further into the work and there's like a little bit more like yeses, I'm clear that the person is able to say yes to themselves. I'm not worried about that. We talk a lot about the difference between what the long-term goals are for how they want to feel in their body and in their life, and then we talk about short-term urges and cravings. And with lots of flexibility we can learn how to say no to short-term urges and cravings that take us further away from how we want to feel long term. Like that is the process, right? If this feels too urgent,
Mhm.
what would it look like to take a few breaths? What does it look like to just see what comes up? What are the thoughts that come up? Where do they come from? How do we break them apart? If it's I'm restricted, that is a big one that comes up for women. This is restriction. Me saying no to the banana bread. I'm like, okay, are you restricted? Like, what did you eat today? Are you well fed? Are you hungry? Um, did you not allow yourself to have carbohydrates today? Have you done things that actually have set you up to feel restricted in this moment? And then if
Yeah.
not, then let's be honest about what's going on. You're not restricted. You can eat whatever you want to eat. What happened the last 5 times you ate banana bread? You know, was it fine?
Yeah, I love
Okay, fine. Was it not fine? What are you willing to accept the consequences of that? Like, this is just to me, this is like being an adult, and we do this with finances. We do this
yeah.
hopefully with television and social media. We do this with relationships, right? Like, if my spending, my short term urges and cravings around things start to get too big and I start to spend too impulsively, it takes me further away from, long term actual feelings of safety, right? Like,
Yeah.
if I start to jeopardize my financial health and well being in the pursuit of these short term urges and cravings, like, there's some work to do there. And the same can be said with food, right?
Totally.
Same with like
Totally.
television, social media, like I was on my phone last night. I sat down to go to bed and like 35 minutes later, I realized I was scrolling Instagram and I'm like, this is not how I want to live my life.
You're so good at Instagram though. So get on there,
I
girl.
haven't,
We
yeah,
all
I
love.
haven't been, I've been really like cutting back, but I love it. But at the same time, I don't mind the engaging part of it, but the mindless scrolling, I was like, I have 2 kids
Yeah,
that are
that's
going to
too
bed. I mean, they're getting into teen years, so they don't need me as much, but I want to be present and I want to get myself to bed. And and like, this is fun, but how do I really want to live my life? And I can balance those things out. I think sometimes where the food conversation is happening, and I get it because we were pushing so hard back against really pervasive diet messaging for so long. But again, having been in this space for a long time, I feel like, not that the anti diet movement isn't still needed, it's very much needed, but there is room. Enough people are aware of it and ready for a little bit more nuance when it comes to the conversation. Yeah.
totally. I love that. And as a naturopathic doctor, I really want to ask you this because as it relates to, I feel like everyone on TikTok, most of my audience, I have built via TikTok. And so what I notice is that most of my audience are like, believe everything on TikTok. And they're always coming to me and they're like, oh my
Yeah.
God, but it's my hormones. And like, I have this thing with my hormones and I think I have PCOS and oh my God, my blood sugars. And there's just like all of these keywords and they don't necessarily know exactly what's going on, but they feel like they probably have a problem. What sort of testing do either you do or do you recommend, if any, to like, can we go to our doctor and be like, I'm worried about this, like I want labs on XYZ? I feel like a lot of women don't even necessarily know what to ask for. And I guess with this question, it is a little bit more specific to women in their 20s and 30s who have been on yo-yo diets. They're maybe not even necessarily on a diet right now, but they feel like, I don't know, I feel like my quote unquote hormones are messed up, or that I have blood sugar issues. I hear that all of the time. What How would you reply to that? And is there like a way that we can actually check it and so that we can move on or move forward in that healing process?
Yeah, I mean, I hear those things too. I hear like, yeah, the blood sugar issues, the hormone stuff. When we're young, like young and then going through like perimenopausal stuff, blood tests for hormones aren't actually great because our hormones are always fluctuating and changing. And so unless we're catching them at like very key moments, it doesn't necessarily give us a lot of information. That said, um, if someone has low energy, if they feel like they're all over the place, I don't think it ever hurts to go get a blood panel just to check. Like, I always want to see for sure, like ferritin. I want to see just like a regular blood count. I want to see sometimes B12. I work at the Kyla Fox Eating Disorder Center, and we do like more comprehensive panels. Sometimes it's like selenium and zinc, and not everybody needs those things. But I think like thyroid is a really big one that I take a look at. Um, Blood sugar and hemoglobin A1C is a really good indicator of how well we're managing our blood sugar long term. Um, I I like to do those, and I like to get that information to sort of rule anything in or out, liver panels, like blood, like lipids. I could sort of, it's just a really comprehensive sort of like what you might get done at a yearly checkup. Although I know it's
Yeah.
getting harder and harder to get that kind of information from medical doctors because they're so overwhelmed, but it's sort of like a standard set of labs, just to rule anything majorly in, majorly out. And then from there, I really just work with symptoms. And I think the best thing to do is to, well, in my opinion, is to be very blunt with people, like we are human beings and it is normal for
Mm.
hormones to fluctuate to a certain degree. It is normal for the week before our period to a certain degree for things to feel different. It is normal for blood sugar to fluctuate at times. Like part of this whole like TikTok culture, but I would even say the Instagram culture, the social media wellness culture in general has sort of made people feel like if things aren't perfect all the time, there's something really wrong with them. Like
Yeah.
I should never have a headache. I should never be bloated. My stomach should never change shape. Like you are a
Yeah.
living, breathing, dynamic being. You are
Yeah.
changeable. Like our body's entire work is to try to maintain homeostasis because we're always moving away from it, you know?
Yeah.
Like our
Yeah.
blood
I
sugar
love
level goes up and then we have to bring them back down. Our heart rate goes up and we bring it back down. Like that is what being a human being is. So I'm
Yeah.
happy to do the labs to rule things out, but then there's like this like come to Jesus moment where it's like this is what being a human being is, and now what are the things that feel really abnormal when we talk through it? Like what feels actually out of the realm of normal, and how do we deal with that? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I love that come to Jesus because I'm similar. I'm very blunt, and sometimes it's clear when I'm speaking to women, and they're clearly just overworking themselves, and so
Yeah.
they're feeling tired, and it's like, oh my god, I feel tired. Like they're like so disgusted with themselves. I'm like, maybe it's because you're tired. Like it honestly, if I had what sounds like your life, I think I'd be pretty tired too. And so kind of accepting that, and I'm not saying, oh, you don't have a problem, like move on, but also giving yourself the kindness and grace to be like, this isn't necessarily my body just effing up necessarily. It's just that I've been overworking myself.
Yeah, and this is
Now,
like that's the like magic point that I love, which is like how do we rule out the nonsense while not
yeah,
dismissing the person and what might actually be going on for them? Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. Now, before we wrap up, we are recording this in winter, and what comes after winter? Spring, when everyone wants to detox. I don't know if you feel comfortable with sharing a few little detox tips, little regimes, something simple that we can maybe one or two little things that are. This might be difficult because would it work across the board for everyone? But is there sort of a detox tip that we might not have heard of, beyond just lemon in the water, for kind of helping ourselves detox into spring or
Yeah, okay,
when
so I'm
spring
super
arrives?
happy to share. I always share with the caveat that like if there's any disordered eating, if there's any purgy behaviors that people have, like, this is not appropriate. But I will say
So,
that the detox, the body supporting techniques that I really love tend to be ones that don't encourage a lot of obsessive like food control or restriction, that really work with our body's natural processes. And the one that might be really weird and interesting for people to hear about that I really love right now, that I do like twice a week, sometimes more, is coffee enemas. I love a coffee.
ooh, I've never done that. I've only ever done like a colonic, which is similar, right? Or
These ones
no?
you just do at home. You have to have like good coffee and some materials, but like it increases our liver's glutathione production like 600% or something wild. Like relatively cheap, relatively accessible. It's not asking you to do anything too wild. Now, again, if there's weird, but for me, it's if there's weird food and purgy things happening, I would never recommend this. But for people who have like a pretty neutral relationship with food in their body, like for me, it has been the thing that's really healed up some digestive things that were going on for a long time for me. That like food restriction never helped with, and like general supplementation on its own never helped with. Um, and then I cold
And you
plunge.
do
Like
that.
as soon as we're done here, I'm gonna go get in the lake. And like I know that this has become kind of like status quo actually at the moment, but several years ago when I started, it was very again, it was like a little weird and a little fringy to be doing this.
It's weird to not now.
It's
You know
kind of
what I
weird
mean?
to not. Yeah.
I don't often cold plunge, and I feel like I'm so strange.
Mm.
But just a quick question on the coffee enema. So you're doing that twice a week, and would you kind of suggest that like twice a week for a month sort of thing, or is that
Yeah,
something that's
it's
so
it's
gentle
really
that you can kind of
it's
do
really
it?
personal. Like some people, if they have really big things going on, sometimes doing them more regularly is great when they get started. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, but it's really, yeah, there's all kinds of things associated with like energy and digestion and yeah, yeah, molds
yeah.
and parasites
It's I
and all those
would
things. Um, but yeah, I can't. I'm just trying to like. I'm feeling like I'm stumbling over words because I'm trying to think of a website that's really good, and I can't think of the name of it. So if it comes to me, I can always like share the link with you, and you could share. But
perfect.
yeah, as with anything, we have to be careful with these things. But there's a lot of great things that can come from coffee enemas, and again, no restriction, no super expensive treatments or methodologies or ideologies needed. It's just easy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that. I'm the same where I'd rather kind of add something in that I feel like is supportive versus, okay, my detox is going to be I'm not touching this because then
Yeah.
it just becomes really charged. So I loved chatting with you.
Mm.
Where can everyone go to stay in touch? And specifically, I'll make sure to link your subscription to your newsletter because I am such a fan of
That would
that
be
newsletter in
so
the
great
show
yeah,
notes.
that would be so great. Healthyish.ca. So healthy-ish.ca is where my website is. And then, yeah, if you share that link to the newsletter, that would be amazing.
Yay! Thank you so much, lovely.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.